In a year ending in 7, Hayao Miyazaki wrote the following. Compared to some of the works of 2 decades ago, which I will always hold as a gold standard, the animation we are making in this decade resembles the food served on jumbo jet airliners. Mass production has changed everything. The emotions and thoughts that should be so moving have given way to showiness, nervousness, and titillation. And work that should be done lovingly by hand has been whittled away within organized production systems that focus on straight work for hire. I frankly despise the truncated word, anime, because to me it only symbolizes the current desolation of our industry. Now, as we sagely nod at the words of the great director, let's see in what year ending in 7 he said this. Was it 2017, at the crest of the light novel fan service tsunami? Was it 2007, as it became clear that the old studios were overheating and working their staff to death? Was it 1997, with the swan song of No. It was 1987, and according to Miyazaki, anime was already dead. This was the year before Akira released, the oldest thing many anime fans have watched. Anime, so far as most people today understand it, barely even exists before Mobile Suit Gundam in 1979. When you see fans of retro anime talking about how anime today is terrible and citing Miyazaki's supposed quote about how anime was a mistake, their rose-tinted past usually begins no earlier than Macross in 82, and often later. Lots of people watch Lupin Part 2. There's some folks who really think Ashita no Joe or Ace wo Nare are peak. But it's hard for me to believe you if you say that your favorite anime came out before Xerox cell transfers and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But according to Miyazaki, this is all moot, because the East had long ago fallen by this point. The only good anime are the ones he grew up with in the 50s and 60s. I say this not as a character assassination of anyone in particular, although it does make some people look foolish. But seeing as anime bad now is such a widespread opinion, I'd like to find a straight answer as to when it was good and when it went bad, because there is clearly some disagreement on this point. So let's go through a couple of the common platitudes about the history of anime. Dude, the 90s was all the best anime. There is intense nostalgia for 90s anime, to the point that it's a genre of anime fandom unto itself. Cowboy Bebop, Evangelion, Sailor Moon. It was a decade absolutely overflowing with great anime, right? I'm gonna pick out a random season from the 90s on my anime list. Let's see all the great shows that came out. I don't want to oversell the point. A lot of the greatest anime did come out in the 90s, but people say this while only citing, maybe 10 short-form TV anime? Some shonen series? A handful of OVAs? A couple of movies by 2 dudes? If you're the sort to dig a little deeper and watch 50-episode kids shows, there's World Masterpiece Theater, but you also find a lot of the same kind of poorly produced, lewd and lascivious material people complain about today. Japan did not get the same peace dividend economic sugar rush as the rest of the rich world. They call the 90s the lost decade for a reason. There are more anime productions than in the previous decade, but a dilution is obvious. The kind of incredibly lavish OVAs we associate with the 80s went into decline. In the early 90s, the production value is lower on average, presumably because they were still using the labor-intensive analog animation processes from before the fall of the Soviet Union, but with tighter purse strings. There was still a lot of talent around, and the pressures created a handful of diamonds, especially in the later half of the decade as the replacement of multiplane cameras and film with digital scanning and compositing made productions considerably smoother. This is why the 90s acquired a reputation, but quantity has to count for something, right? Were the Clinton years really the only good time for anime, or just when the 3 shows you're the most nostalgic for came out? With some people, I'm inclined to say, you don't like the 90s, you just like one show. I totally understand getting wrapped up in Sailor Moon or classic Dragon Ball Z, or those whose only anime they've liked is Cowboy Bebop. I think these are totally valid opinions, but only so far as it doesn't extend to making broad generalizations about things you haven't even watched. Cowboy Bebop is an absolutely singular show and one of my favorites. As much as I think that the people who say this could find other anime they enjoy if they expanded their horizons, I struggle to come up with any anime that are all that similar to Bebop. But that's exactly the thing. There was no prior era where every other anime was like Cowboy Bebop. A single point is not a trend, unless you can cite at least a few other shows over some period of time. You can't say that anime collectively was on top of some hill that it could roll down afterwards. With older anime and genres which continue to be common, it's clear that this is more about the cultural cachet of a particular show instead of the merit of what came afterwards. I get being attached to the particular iconography and art style of the original Sailor Moon, but it's not as if they stopped making that kind or quality of anime. There's been a new Precure every year for 20 years, and they are often the best looking anime on TV. Never mind the rich variety of shonen you can be watching nowadays. Can you really argue they forgot how to make them after DBZ? If you're a mecha fan, you might have a bit of a point, because verifiably, the industry in a literal sense forgot how to draw mechas after the 2000s. But I think there's a demand side to that equation, and not just the supply side, so it's out of the scope of this video for now. There are also some 90s anime which were like on American TV years ago, or have otherwise become mimetic, which people will insist are classics despite never really having watched them closely. Shows like Initial D First Stage are objectively a miserable experience outside your nostalgic memories or YouTube clips. What really puzzles me most about the cult of the 90s is that it's not like there's some immediate decline afterwards. The early 2000s are insanely prolific. I'd argue there are as many interesting and high-quality anime between 2000 and 2005 as there are between 1990 and 1999. Which I guess is why people don't really provide a date when things go bad. They just say things like, "Anime went bad when it got all horny and weird." On its face, this totally tracks. Neon Genesis Evangelion set the gold standard for what an otaku-forward anime looks like, but this was interpreted in many different ways, some more superficial than others. In the subsequent years, we perceive a dramatic rise in the number of really gross and horny harem shows full of panty shots and bouncing high schooler booba. Part of this is definitely the rise of a business model centered around selling DVD sets and merchandise to a minority of highly engaged fans, often young teenagers and man-children spending their allowance, hence the younger characters. Sex sells, as always. But you know what we also see in this time period? An explosion in the number of anime that come out. Just compare the number of releases in the 90s seasons we were just looking at with those in the aughts. In the 60-plus years of anime as a medium, the vast majority of all the anime ever released came out in the last 2 decades. I would not be so quick to assume that an anime you don't like is actively displacing the creation of something better. It might be that the amount of fat in the system has simply grown. There's also no small amount of survivorship bias at play. Because I hate to break it to you, the horny is not new to anime.
やっぱナウシカの胸にはすごいこだわりを感じます、胸の表現ちょっといやらしいこれやっぱりサービスカットだよね、
The direct-to-video era was sickeningly violent and exploitative. The late-night anime of the 90s and early aughts, while fewer in number, were no less spicy. I guess Miyazaki could have been saying that anime had fallen in 1987 because that was the year Urutsugi Doji dropped. But those shows have mostly faded into cultural obscurity, while the number of that kind of anime have grown and get widely promoted by the seasonal anime community cycle on the internet. Though when you look at the seasonal anime cycle, you quickly see the other scourge that people refer to. When everything became Isekai. This is a complaint that's most common among people who really follow seasonal anime cycles. Around the turn of the millennium, the centuries-old literary tradition of contemporary characters being transported to another time or place was reincarnated in the fantasy world of Japan. Anime which specifically exists to riff off and parody RPGs have also existed since dinosaurs walked the earth. But after the massive "Here Crossing Field Over the Speakers at Hot Topic" commercial success of Sword Art Online in 2012, anime charts were inundated with isekai set in video games or video game-like settings for the better part of a decade, and the floodwaters have yet to entirely recede today. Or at least, that's how I remember the story going. There's a lot of reasons why the video game isekai took off. It's a format that lends itself to being able to quickly assemble a story around a single catchy gimmick, using a catalog of tropes that require no introduction. You all play video games, right, viewers? It's a death game or a love comedy or some horrible creaking non-story set in a generic fantasy setting. And I have a strange superpower or a niche kind of baddie or have been turned into a wacky creature or inanimate object. And when people get tired of that, you can re-baseline and get everyone to say you're incredible by vaulting over that low standard. I think part of the reason why isekai became such a monster is because it fundamentally appeals to a lot of the people who watch anime, the database animals. The endless iteration and variation of basic genre fiction, the same way anime fans of the late aughts watched palette swaps of the same character voiced by the same actress in every show. But it's also because the anime industry is bad at healthily responding to trends. The anime industry is a responsive system, but one with a huge phase delay and no D-term. Okay, what do I mean by this? It takes a minimum of 2 years and change for a TV anime to go from concept or source selection to airing. So you can figure out what the unoriginal, trend-chasing anime production committees were watching, or at least were watching the profits of, by going back 2 or 3 years. Kind of like how you can figure out what movie your parents went to the night you were conceived by going back 3 trimesters. Look here. Sword Fart Online seeps through the sphincter in 2012. For reasons which are easy to understand but cringeworthy in hindsight, it became massively popular. Log Horizon was essentially a contemporary and a good show, but there really aren't many other isekai at this time. Flash forward about 3 years to 2015. Overlord and Gate start dropping, as well as shows I'm just going to call isekai from here on, like Is It Wrong to Pick Up Girls in a Dungeon, which use a distinctly video game-based setting even if the characters are native to their world. In 2016, we get even more of the foundational examples, like ReZero and Konosuba. What I find really ironic here is that many of the first isekai light novels to be adapted to anime are the ones that people today describe as a breath of fresh air that really shake up the tired isekai genre. This might have been true for web novels at the time, but objectively, in the mid-2010s there wasn't a lot of generic isekai anime to be subverted. It's around 2017 into 2018 that they start to arrive in force. Smartphone Isekai, Knights and Magic, Restaurant to Another World, Death March to the Parallel World Rhapsody, How Not to Summon a Demon Lord, Pingu in the City, Merchen Meichen, Conception, The Slimy One, Mahojin Boogaloo Electric Guru Guru, The Master of Ragnarok and the Blesser of Erenjar. And then in 2019, all bets are off, and we start to get the really wild ones, like Rising of the Shield Hero, Isekai Cheat Magician, Summoned to Another World as an Elf, The Other Woman-Beating One, Ari Fureta, Mao-sama Retry, High School Prodigies Have It Easy in Another World. There are so many, I put a fake one in there just to keep you on your toes. That's right, Rising of the Shield Hero was just a figment of your imagination. Even though it's like a train derailment in slow motion, I can't say that the isekai waves have been all bad. I mean, Isekai Oji-san was pretty fun, the girls in that are all of age. I suspect we're seeing good shows like Frieren and Dungeon Meshi in some small part because of isekai creating a baseline interest in fantasy. And I think we need to remember what came before. Page through my anime list from 2010 to 2012. There's some great anime, some decently fun anime, and what I would politely call charmingly ambitious anime. But the bulk of every season can be fit into a vague box of rom-com, harem, fanservice vehicles on a sliding scale of lewdness. Some are more fantasy action than strictly high school, some of them are a lot more fun or artistically interesting than others. But it's all easy to dismiss as the kind of "Uwu senpai, I'm 18 in the relevant jurisdictions" stuff that anime gets so widely condemned for. The folks who wanted to chase trends chased them, from high school battle harems to isekai, to more obviously unoriginal but ultimately equally uninteresting results. The folks who were trying to make good anime have kept doing so about as often as they always have been. I would argue that if you trawl through the charts from 1990 to today, there are pretty consistently 1 to 3 good anime that don't gross out the general audience coming out every year. The rate has gotten higher in recent years, if anything. When we compress decades into some short time period called the past, we forget that all the classic shows came out in fits and starts with years in between them. You take a trickling stream and ask why it barely fills your glass today, pointing to a lake it has filled over decades. Never mind the anime we agree to be classic now, but never had a large audience back in the day. Even with ubiquitous anime discourse, great anime flies under the radar. Perhaps in hindsight, some of them will become cult classics, or maybe making good anime is like casting pearls before swine. 7 years ago, Girls' Last Tour dropped as a commercial failure, and the world just fucking watched Blend S. So in general, I disagree with notions that anime is in some inexorable decline from some Edenic past when the industry lived in innocence and knew not famine or war or pestilence. Relatively, things seem pretty good right now in this season of autistic elves. Though if you really are just a connoisseur of hand-painted animation, I guess you might have a point. Even if a lot of these 80s OVAs have horrible writing, there's just a particular analog look to painted frames and backgrounds which is irreplaceable. And there aren't many anime in the modern day which even attempt to hit that apex of production value. Personally, I have a soft spot for that window between 1995 and 2003, where the best anime was still being hand-painted, but then composited and edited on a computer for that rich but crisp effect. If you look at the absolute best animation cuts made recently, it's clear there's nothing inherently preventing all digital animation from being made to the same or higher standards. But the Japanese economy and the anime market isn't what it once was. They can't count on the sales of $100 laserdiscs, and the endless grind of TV anime productions probably sands the enthusiasm off the staff. On the other hand, as much as bad pay and overwork in the industry is a problem or even the problem holding back anime, based on what information is available, I doubt it's gotten much worse from the new millennium to today. I have a hard time believing that 15 years ago, when Studio Madhouse was the apex predator making 100 anime a season, that they were any kinder to their people than Studio Mappa is today. I just think there was less of an English anime community to make memes about it back then. Based on what numbers can be found, TV anime has always been produced on frighteningly small budgets, and the number of labor hours per minute of animation has not grown, without opening the can of worms which is the strength of the yen vice the currencies with which foreign outsourcing is hired. But it's also obvious that great things are still possible when studios are forward-looking enough to invest in a core of great animators, produce shows on a reasonable schedule, and select good material with a clear path to monetization. So maybe instead of seething about cultural degeneracy and dropping hot takes about how that one anime you watched must be totally unique because it didn't suck, take a moment to peruse some anime charts. Look at other shows made by creators of things you've liked. Look at anime that have been going to Netflix. That's mostly been a good bet. I think you'll find that it's not all bad. Or at least, it's bad as it always has been.